I'm very happy to be here tonight to support this campaign. And I'd like to explain why. I don't feel it should be necessary, but it probably is necessary, to say that I'm not here in support of Vladimir Putin, although this is the kind of generalised view that always happens every time you oppose our government's foreign policy. You're told you support their enemy. That isn't the case. I particularly think that what he did in Chechnya was an absolutely terrible thing, although of course we didn't get the outcry from the British or the US governments when that happened, because he was their ally in the war on terror and he was dealing with his terrorists. So I wanted to make that clear first of all. I also want to make clear that I support self-determination for Ukraine. I think it should be an independent country. But we have to look at what is actually going on there, and we also have to look at what the forces are involved. And it seems to me there are two big issues that are involved in this question of Ukraine. The first is the question of Western imperialism, which is definitely on the move in terms of expanding eastwards through NATO, and that is, in my view, one of the biggest threats to world peace that exists today. And the second thing that we have to take account of is the rise of fascism in Ukraine, the situation which Richard has described, which I don't want to repeat. But it seems to me a very, very strange irony that just a couple of weeks after, or just over a week after, some of the worst European election results that we've seen in recent history, in terms of the growth of far-right parties, the growth of some overtly fascist parties in various parts of Europe, that there is one spot in Ukraine where this issue, the growth of the far right and the growth of fascists, is very largely ignored by the media, by the government and by sections of the left. In my view, it's a complete disgrace that people don't understand that this is going on, or don't want to understand, or in some way feel that they have to kind of justify the Ukrainian government, that somehow it's not quite as bad as everyone's saying, and that really it's just some sort of far-right people who aren't really very significant. It's absolutely clear that is very far from being the case. It's absolutely clear that when you look at these militias who are attacking in eastern Ukraine, there's a very, very big proportion of right sector in them, and it's absolutely clear that when you look at some of the actions, in particular the bombing today, which strikes me as a war crime, I don't see, can you imagine in most countries if a government actually bombed a council building, as has happened today, and killed people? Can you imagine that there wouldn't be an instant outcry at the United Nations and talk about their bombing their own people and all this kind of thing? Nothing of the sort is going on in terms of Ukraine, and it seems to me that this is the question we have to really discuss tonight. And when you actually look at that, we are having a barrage of propaganda from our government, which has been going on for months now. We're told, on the BBC today, they refer to the people in the East as pro-Russian protesters. Why not anti-government protesters? If we agree that Ukraine is one country, why shouldn't they be the protesters against their own government, as you would describe them anywhere else? You have a situation where we even get, it's kind of like the Charge of the Light Brigade. You get the Russian bear, which everyone knows has been, dying to attack everyone everywhere for a long, long time. You get this kind of rhetoric about it. Now, actually, let's look at what has happened. Again, when there was the question of Crimea, and Richard, I agree with what he says about the situation in the Crimea, and it seems to me there were quite a few things wrong with having the vote in the way that they did, but I can't actually imagine that that vote would have come to a different conclusion under whatever conditions it was taken. But let's look at that, why by all agreement there was virtually, there were very little casualties and all this kind of thing. Let's look at what happened there, and let's compare it with what they say about all the situation which is now going on in eastern Ukraine. It seems to me there is a real double standard here which we have to look at. And that double standard comes from our own rulers, who are saying that NATO is somehow a force for good. Now, it seems to me that when you look at what NATO is doing, it has now expanded. There was an agreement given with the end of the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, back, 20, 25 years ago. The agreement was that if Germany was unified, there would not be expansion eastwards of NATO. That was the agreement that was given to Mikhail Gorbachev. You could say that he was naive for believing anything that the Americans said to him, but nonetheless, that is the agreement that was given. Since then, NATO has expanded to nearly all of the former Soviet country, or former parts of the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states, but also to the former countries like Poland, which were in the Warsaw Pact. Now, it is not in any way, just as somebody said to me the other day, you can understand how Germany in 1914 felt, you know, it didn't have enough empires and all this kind of thing. It is not in any way to defend Putin to say that you can imagine how the Russians kind of feel about this, that you now have manoeuvres going on in Estonia, less than 100 miles from the Russian border. In July of this year, there are going to be NATO manoeuvres in the Ukraine, and can you imagine what that will do in the situation that we are now facing? So all of those questions, we have to look at what NATO is doing. And NATO is not a force for peace. Actually, CND are people who describe NATO as a terrorist organisation. It's an organisation that has bombed a whole number of countries, that is involved in all sorts of different parts of the world. And of course, it is getting a lot of support from the neocons in the United States, who talk very, very much about being able to expand even further, and who talk about the possibility of war in Eastern Europe. And a war in Eastern Europe, we already have a new Cold War, another war in Eastern Europe, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the Baltic states, or wherever it is, over the next 5 or 10 years, we are talking about a war of massive proportions, which will have massive casualties and will be an absolutely horrific war. Now, it seems to me that the neocons, Richard referred to Victoria Nuland, who said, fuck the EU, but of course, this tells you something, I suppose, about American diplomats, but the really interesting thing that she said is actually that she predicted and decided who the next government was going to be, and that, it seems to me, is a question for democracy, surely. And surely we should be saying that. It's all right. John McCain was part of the demonstrations with the right wing in Kiev before the change of government. So all of those, we know what is going on here. And, you know, there's a kind of, I get rather fed up with this kind of, you know, the beginner's guide to geopolitics kind of approach which goes on, which is, you know, America's declining power and it's a multipolar world and all these sorts of things. This is all true, but it's also all relative. Let's look at the United States has more military power than its next 10, the next 10 top military spenders in the world. That is still the situation. They have bases in hundreds of countries around the world. And a declining power is not necessarily a power that is safer or more at ease with itself. Actually, it's a power which has gone to war more in the last 20 years than it did in the previous 50 years. So we need to be aware of exactly what a threat NATO and the US imperialism is. And we also need to, I think, be very critical of the people who downplay what is going on in the Ukraine in terms of the search for allies against Russia. It seems to me what happened in Odessa was an absolutely hideous thing. Now people say, you know, at first it looked to me fairly obvious what had happened from the films and from the reports and so on. And then you get this kind of counter-narrative that comes out, oh, it wasn't really like that, it was much more complicated. I'm sure these things are complicated, but this was a trade union building that was burnt down. This was a building where dozens and dozens of people were killed as a result of the attack, and where it is clear that certainly elements of the crowd saw it as an attack on people who they opposed politically. So I think we need to be clear about that, and I think we need to be clear about this threat of the far right and fascism. You know, there's all sorts of debates. How do you define fascism? What is neo-fascism? What is the far right? All these kind of things. But, you know, if they're burning down trade union buildings, if they're attacking people, if there are all sorts of hit squads and militias which are behaving in this kind of way, if they're referring back to the history of Ukrainian nationalism and fascism in the Second World War, which, let's remember, is an absolutely gruesome history and a very different, you know, when you look at the far right and the rise of fascism in Ukraine, it's rather a different picture from, say, the history of fascism in Britain, for example. It's a very different question of collaboration, of pogroms and of all the things they were involved in. I think, you know, if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, well, maybe it is a duck, and we ought to really be looking at it in that kind of way. Now, just to conclude, I want to say this, that we are campaigning in Stop the War, and we always have, against NATO intervention. We've been very involved in some of these things. We have a petition against the manoeuvres in Ukraine, calling on the British government to withdraw from them. which we sent to we put it on the Downing Street website, which if you get 100,000 signatures to a petition, then you can have a debate in Parliament. Now, this isn't, you know, I mean, okay, this is a petition and it's a debate in Parliament. It doesn't sound the most threatening thing in the world, but obviously the Ministry of Defence saw it differently, because we sent the petition in once, then we sent it in twice. It normally gets moderated within 24, 48 hours. 3 weeks later, we had absolutely no reply from them, so we decided to go to the press, and within 2 hours of releasing our press release, suddenly it appeared on the Downing Street website. So I hope people here will do everything they can to support it. It is about solidarity in the sense that it's about what we can do against our own government, which to me is the most important and powerful thing that we're able to do in this country. The other thing is that NATO is having a summit in South Wales early in September. We have a demonstration and a counter summit and various things planned from the 30th of August, 31st of August onwards in Cardiff and in Newport. So obviously we want people to support that initiative, to make sure that we mobilise for it, because this very much, they failed in Afghanistan, they failed in Iraq, they failed in Libya. They are now trying to turn the theatre of war much more centrally to what is going on in Eastern Europe. And we have to be absolutely clear that that is a major threat, not just to the people of Ukraine, who are already suffering very, very badly as a result of this, but to the people of Western Europe as well. And that is why we have to oppose it.